Well, I'm very happy to welcome Ryan York here for a conversation about the brain and how decisions are made, and especially what happens when people are feeling love. Now, this class is about compassion and kindness, that kind of love, agape love. But I think people would be interested also to hear a little bit about what happens in the brain when people feel other kinds of love.
Sure. Neuroscience now kind of understands, at least in humans, that the most studied kind of form of love that people have looked at is romantic relationships. And there's kind of a general model that's coming out that shows two stages of this type of love. The first being very romantic, where you're kind of obsessed with the other person, and that tends to elicit a lot of activity from parts of your brain that are involved in they kind of overlap with almost addictive behaviors and kind of obsessive thoughts, and it releases certain types of neurotransmitters that you may have heard of called dopamine, and it also will make your peripheral nervous system very active, so you're very excited to try to find that person. And that generally will lead to the more kind of pleasant feelings that people experience when they're falling in love. And there's a lot of studies that have been conducted looking at the activity of the brain when people are in this state and find really unique patterns of activity associated with that. And then the second stage, as the relationship tends to settle down and become more secure, it'll transition into a different type of stable love that might be more similar to this type of agape or compassionate love that the Course is concerned with, where there it's more, and this is very generally speaking, it's defined by releases of chemicals in your brain called oxytocin, vasopressin. These are things that tend to promote pair bonding, affiliative behavior, a feeling of connectedness with this person. And from a perspective of the actual parts of your brain that are working in that case, it tends to shift from the original stage where the portions of your brain that are more involved in kind of the sensation of your body and goal-directed behavior are transferred into these more kind of top-down control processes from the kind of more front of your brain, the cortex it's called, that will then modulate those desires and instead promote behaviors that tend to be more in recognition of the other person. So those are kind of the two stages that neuroscientists now, at least in humans, recognize. Yeah.
One time I had a neuroscientist visit my class, and he said, the brain is built for love. If you have perfect connection in the brain, then it's healthy, I guess. And he, I think, considered love perfect connection. That's how he defined it, really. Thoughts?
Yeah, so for humans, we are so social, and it's so important for us to be in stable relationships and to have a place within our social communities that it seems to definitely have health benefits, not only in the functioning of your brain, but potentially even over time, the structure of it. So there's work now, too, that supports the idea that certain types of meditation that benefit cultivating compassion and loving kindness can actually increase the gray matter in your brain. So this is the kind of more processing component of your brain. So there's definitely lines of evidence out there that having stable, positive, loving social relationships benefits the brain.
I think what he meant was connection, and that question of connection is pure connection, love. But I wanted to have a little fun and hear what your research and how you came to be able to make the transition between the research you do and the things we've just been talking about.
Yeah, sure. So what I study is love in a very abstracted sense, because it's much more basic, and it's studying courtship and mating behaviors in very social fish. And so unlike humans, these fish don't form stable bonds. They don't form very complex, lasting social relationships, but they do put a very, very large amount of effort into attracting one another for the purpose of producing offspring. And what makes it interesting is that for whatever reason, these behaviors, evolutionarily speaking, tend to be very unique in the biology that's underlying them, the genes that are involved in them, and they tend to vary greatly if you look at multiple species across species. So two closely related species may have totally different ways of mating. The males will build little sandcastles to attract females, and each species has its unique way of doing it. So it could be that males in one species will make a really large sandcastle with some turrets around it. It could be another species digs out a big pit, and the females respond to this and they mate. And if the males make it in a way that's satisfying to the females, they will mate, and therefore the males will be able to pass on their genes and biological information to the next generation. But so what we found actually is that if you go in and look at the genomes of these fish, so if you look across all the genes that they have, the way that they differ from each other is actually the way that humans tend to differ when you look at neuropsychiatric disorders. It tends to be very complex in terms of the amount of genes that are involved. So it suggests that when you see changes in behavior, not just necessarily reproductive behavior, but kind of more broadly, within populations or across time, it tends to be similar, not only when you look amongst humans, but other animals as well. So we're starting to get a kind of more general picture of what to expect when you try to understand the biological bases of these things.
And one quick question, and then I'd like to go back to humans
Sure.
and the brain, and that is, have you come to have answers to those questions, that indeed there is this kind of diversity in human brains?
So you could think about pretty easily how in fish, potentially the complexity of their brain to process these kind of signals of courtship, or even if you want to be loose with the language of love, could become more complex over time through that selection. It's interesting to think about in humans then, because there are hypotheses out there that the human brain and the more specific traits we have, such as language, complex cognition, even consciousness, are products of this process too, and that for whatever reason they came about because females liked males who were able to whisper more complex poetry or handle more complex problems. And that is actually a leading theory of why the human brain evolved so fast, because it was only, as far as we can tell, maybe I think within the last several tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, that we started showing this incredible behavioral complexity. So the question is, how could that happen so quickly? One of the answers that's convenient for that is that potentially it's sexual selection, because elsewhere in nature we know that is an evolutionary process that can make change happen very rapidly. So that is a neat hypothesis to think about with humans. And it'll be very interesting if more data come out to support that over time.
Anything else you felt like saying, particularly relating it, I hope, to agape love? Because I don't want to get too far away from that.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's evidence. I mean, so evolutionary biologists like to explain altruism from a genetic relatedness perspective, that when you see it, it tends to be because you're living in a community where everybody is somewhat related to each other, so it benefits you to help save some other member if they're your cousin. And the amount of effort you'll put into it, people theorize, scales with the amount of relatedness. So the question is, why in humans would we do that for people we're not related to? And it seems like it is likely related to the expansion of cognitive ability we have, that we have the ability to not only reason about other people, but somehow elicit an empathic response in us to allow. So it's not just necessarily hardwired that we're going to try to only save the people in our family, but instead, for whatever reason, we tend to have a kind of a more general purpose mechanism where we're able to, not everybody does, but at least we're capable of cultivating a sense of affiliation or agape love for members of our community that in kind of a strict evolutionary biological sense, we shouldn't necessarily feel that for. And I don't know if that's so rare. There's increasing evidence in other primates that this can happen, and it kind of it goes against the idea that it's solely a genetic question, and it could be more complex about social behavior, about if you are able to reason about social behavior and it benefits you as a community to be affiliated with each other, to feel some sense of connection, that in itself can evolve and persist. But yeah, definitely the question of altruism is, the jury's still out, I think, scientifically in that sense of.
And the big question for me, from what you've just said, is that it's one thing to feel empathy and maybe be capable, because of our brains or whatever, to feel empathy, but it's another thing to go the next step to compassion, which is to actually do something.
Right.
You know, that, and hopefully that can be trained.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of interesting work is being done now with dogs. That's actually kind of a unique area that might relate to this, because in a way dogs are this interesting experiment in evolution where we've selected for traits that make them more and more not necessarily like us but capable of understanding us. So there have been some recent publications showing that dogs can recognize a very large number of human emotions. They are very sensitive to the tone of your voice and are pretty much constantly reading people's behavior and act. So this is a really interesting case where two species have created this relationship. And to a certain extent, dogs almost have developed the ability to feel, using these words is kind of difficult, but something like empathy or compassion for another species and provide that almost service for us. So that is another really interesting place to think about that. It's not necessarily limited to humans, that there's capacities for this in other animals.
And have people been looking at dogs' brains?
They have. They actually stick dogs in
and
big
observing changes.
Scanners, and there's actually pretty funny pictures that will come out of those experiments too. You'll see a dog coming out of an MRI machine and just having been imaged. But yeah, so we're starting to get a sense too of what's going on in the dog brain while they're thinking about humans.
Well, back to humans and the point that maybe we can teach by exercising the brain more compassion and kindness among people. That's kind of my interest. Comments about that?
Meditators or people who practice prayer, certain types of contemplation like that, over time can actually produce pretty large-scale changes in the connectivity of your brain and the overall makeup of certain portions of your brain. And that actually, if you look at long-term practitioners of these, so if you bring in a Tibetan Buddhist monk who's practiced loving-kindness meditation for decades, their brain will look substantially different from others. And what really is going on there is you're actually strengthening, there's evidence that suggests that you're strengthening the connections in the brain that are the same ones that tend to come online or are more active as you transition from, like I was mentioning earlier, the initial erotic stages of a relationship to the more stable, compassionate, potentially bonded stages of a relationship. So these kind of top-down control of yourself type connections that are being preferentially strengthened. So that's not exactly love changing the brain, but they are practices that promote a way of being in the world that might allow you to feel greater affiliative, emotions toward others, and maybe a lot of the emotions that would overlap with this sense of agape love.
Well, there's a quote from Gandhi that goes something like, "Love between individuals is a prerequisite to peace between nations." And this reminds me of that. I mean, if we have enough people who are feeling and behaving in the context of love, maybe we can move toward a more peaceful world.
Yeah, and it does seem like this is the case, if you in some way could almost help yourself out by changing your biology toward that. So by doing some kind of practice that allows your brain to be more predisposed to acting one way or the other, maybe that would be a really nice thing. Yeah.
Thanks very much,
Yeah,
Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah.